Thank you for joining us today. We'll start with the land acknowledgement. We're thankful to be able to join you from the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat. Our guest speakers today were students at the University of Waterloo at the time of publishing the practice guide that highlights effective tools for protecting, managing, and increasing tree canopy coverage on private land. I'll now pass it over to Melissa Geyt to introduce the group and to start us off. And now we will have a Q&A session after the presentation. Please feel free to use the Q&A section or the chat section, or just raise your hand if you would like to ask a question after the presentation. So Melissa, the virtual floor is all yours. I will stop sharing my screen.
And thank you for having us today. My name is Melissa, and I'm here with my former classmates from the University of Waterloo, Kaitlin, Theresa, and Vignesh. And today, as Juliet mentioned, we are, and you all know, we are going to be talking about a practice guide that we developed as part of a studio project during our master's program about protecting and increasing and managing urban trees, specifically on private property. So, and I'll get a little bit more into the details of how that project came about in a little bit later. And as Juliet mentioned, we have a lot of time dedicated for questions, but at any point, please feel free to raise your hand or throw questions or comments into the chat, and we can also address things as we're going throughout the presentation. So as mentioned, my name is Melissa. I just finished at the University of Waterloo this past semester, and I'm starting a job as a policy analyst, and I'll pass it over to Kaitlin to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kaitlin Webber. I think I'm the last straggling student still in the master's program at the University of Waterloo, but I am also working full-time as a planner in private.
I can jump in here. My name is Theresa O'Neill, and I'm a planner on the land development side of things, and have been working in private practice for about the last 8 or 9 months now.
Hi, I'm Vignesh. I'm working as an environmental planner, and I've been in private consulting for over a year in the sector.
Thanks, everyone. So a little bit of background on how this project came about. So as many of you know, private trees comprise a significant portion of urban canopy, as much as 50% in some municipalities in Ontario. And so this project began as a study for the city of St. Catharines. And I don't know if anyone from St. Catharines is here today. Feel free to chime in at the end if anybody is. They were looking for ways to increase their canopy coverage. They had done a study that showed that they only had a tree canopy of about 16%. This was around 2019, versus the recommended 30% that's a target for a lot of municipalities. And a city study had found that around 65% of the urban tree canopy in the city was actually on private property. So city administration were worried about tree removal in private spaces. For example, a developer buying a lot and clear cutting the whole thing. So they were looking for ways to protect that canopy, and they tried to put through a private tree bylaw, which did not end up passing due to public opposition. So they were looking for alternatives. So they ended up approaching the School of Planning, and we ended up doing some research for them and putting together first a report for the city of St. Catharines. That was in December of 2019. And then we later ended up taking that work and putting it together into a practice guide that included recommendations for Ontario municipalities, as well as kind of an overview of our key findings. And that was published in July of 2020. And we will provide a link to that full report at the end, as well as the appendices that contain all of the research and findings that we did at that time. We did a little bit of a review, kind of a national context, as we're going to be presenting this report for the CIP conference this summer. But just to note that the Ontario specific research is current to the end of 2019. And I'll pass it over to Vignesh now.
As Melissa discussed, so we use different research methods to inform our key findings and recommendations. We used 4 different methods to understand the state of private tree protection and management in Ontario. So I will outline some of the interesting findings like following after I outline these research processes. So this work was done in 2019. We used environmental scan or literature review to explore the current state of urban forestry literature in Ontario. Then we used Ontario provincial policy and legislative overview. So in this process, we wanted to establish the planning hierarchy as it applies to trees on private property. Then we used municipal policy scan, which included in-depth review of 17 Ontario municipalities' official plans, tree bylaws, urban design guidelines, and urban forestry management plans as they pertain to private trees. We also looked at tree-related programs in each of these municipalities. And finally, we used municipal staff survey as our method. We reached out to all 17 municipalities, and we received responses from over 13 municipal staff members to learn about, and we learned about the effectiveness of different policies and programs that they have in place. And we used these results from 4 methods to develop our recommendations for municipalities. And which we will spend the remainder of the time discussing. So I will briefly start describe what we did as part of the environmental scan. So I'll outline some of the more interesting findings that we came across as part of environmental scan, which included we looked at more gray and academic literature to come up with these findings. So municipalities adopted different standards because of the lack of concrete urban forestry best practices guidelines in Ontario and Canada. So they use standards which are American or international. Municipalities are considering the effects of climate change and adopting practices to adapt to climate change as part of their urban forestry policies. And we also found that cities favor male trees over female trees because female trees shed fruits and are considered more messy by municipalities. This leads to increased allergies due to pollen from male trees because there are a disproportionate amount of male trees when compared to female trees in our cities. Effectiveness of tree protection is harder to evaluate at this juncture, as most of these policies have been adopted in recent years because of increased awareness about the importance of trees in our communities in combating different problems. So demographic factors like age and education and the presence of urban forestry management plans in municipalities were found to affect resident perspectives and participation when it comes to tree protection and management in our cities. That's one of the findings we came across as part of the environmental scan. And now Theresa will talk about policy and legislative overview.
Perfect. So the goal of this method was to establish the provincial policy and legislative framework under which private urban tree protection measures can be undertaken. We reviewed relevant provincial plans and policies in Ontario, which included planning documents and other acts, a full list of which is on the slide here and can be found in the guide itself. Overall, we found that Ontario has a hierarchical approach and provides specific authority jurisdiction related to trees. While this can be beneficial, it is also a challenge, as we found that provincial plans can be pretty broad and lack specific tools that a municipality can enact in order to protect private urban trees. Additionally, at the provincial level, there's very little policy related to enforcement, which moves this matter into the development planning process, and therefore tree protection is made a matter of, or is made the responsibility of municipal administration and council. And as such, while there are some provincial policies, provincial policies that municipalities can leverage, there are few of them and they are lacking quote unquote teeth and might even be a little outside the municipality or regional jurisdiction. We then, as part of our methods, we then conducted a municipal policy scan with the goal of determining how Ontario municipalities are approaching private tree protection through policies. And for this method, we first looked at planning policies enacted by municipal governments. And through assessing official plans and urban design guidelines, we found 4 distinct themes of policies. The first one being the theme of protection and preservation, which encompasses a variety of policies that pertain to the protection of existing trees on private land, protecting them from destruction during construction or development outright. And within the design element and function theme, the policies, these policies address tree protection and tree management from a design standpoint by promoting the benefits of trees for both residents and for ecosystem services. Policies within this third theme, ecosystem management systems approach, address the role that trees play in the overall ecosystem, specifically why and how best to conduct tree planting efforts to ensure the longevity of the urban tree canopy. And lastly, enforcement policies explicitly connected tree protection mechanisms into the development application process. Next, as part of the municipal policy scan, we looked at the urban forest management plans of 17 municipalities, and we found that these ranged in style and approach, from very high-level plans of action that focus on visionary statements and urban forest goals to specific recommendations and directions for a municipality to undertake in order to enhance the municipality's urban forest. And then lastly, within this method, we looked at any available private tree cutting bylaws for the 17 municipalities. And by looking at this, or looking at these, we found that there's 2 main considerations, specifically the application of the bylaw. For example, a private tree cutting bylaw being applicable only to trees of a certain caliper or trees located within a certain land use designation. And the second being the requirements of obtaining a permit. These varied. For example, some municipalities had more stringent standards, such as including an arborist report and community letters of support in order to remove a tree, while other municipalities, you simply had to let a staff member at the municipality know your intention to remove a tree.
All right, so moving on to the final component of our study, and kind of as an interesting aside, this municipal staff survey is actually what led us to develop the practice guide, because from our responses, we found that municipalities and staff were really interested in the results and wanted us kind of desperately to share our results with them because they kind of felt a little bit misguided about what they should be doing. So again, this was the final component of our study, and it was a standardized survey of key informants from our 17 case study municipalities, of which I think we received about 13 responses. And the goal of this was to, one, learn about the effectiveness of tree policies and the different programs that municipalities employ. And these surveys revealed some interesting insights, some of which I will share now, but feel free to look at the guide for a more detailed review. So first and foremost, municipalities reported that private tree cutting bylaws were the most effective tool simply because they are an actual enforcement tool. They have defined processes and they also have penalties for non-compliance. However, in municipalities without private tree cutting bylaws, some staff reported success in using the Ontario Heritage Act, for example, to protect either individual trees with historical significance all the way to trees in entire neighborhoods. And second, we learned about some of the challenges faced in municipalities with regard to adopting and enforcing tree policies. And I think this is really, again, what led to the interest in sharing our results. So for example, while many municipalities cited interest in adopting a private tree cutting bylaw, as Melissa mentioned at the beginning of our presentation, they frequently cited community opposition, lack of an implementation strategy at the municipal level, and lack of internal resources as to why one maybe hasn't been adopted yet. And additionally, informants described challenges faced related to the development process. As in most cases, development activity overrides tree protection policies. And we learned of many instances where developers will clear cut their lots before submitting a site plan application in order to avoid any tree policies present in that municipality. And lastly, we learned about the different types of programs that municipalities adopt and also of their effectiveness. And overall, the municipalities we studied employ a diverse range of tree-related programs and events, and they generally focus either on resident education about tree knowledge and tree stewardship to the actual planting of trees. And while some municipalities organize these programs and events internally, they're increasingly partnering with outside organizations or other organizations within the municipal structure. One really good example, especially in Southwestern Ontario, is LEAF. But other municipalities said they were partnering with their local conservation authorities, local school boards, and they said that this was really beneficial because it could take some of the burden off the municipal staff, and it also leverages external expertise, so kind of a win-win there. But overall, with these programs, despite the differences in how they're structured, respondents highlighted their importance in improving residents' knowledge of trees, how to maintain the trees on their property, and overall the role of trees in the health of their community, which we believe in turn might result in greater support for tree-related policies down the line. We can go to the next slide. So based on the key findings from our various methods that we presented, we established 12 general recommendations in our report. And these recommendations can fall generally into the 3 categories on the screen, which are enforcement tools, planning policies, and programs and events. And we will spend the remainder of this presentation looking at each of these recommendations. And you'll see as we go that we've attached the corresponding icons to each recommendation, so you can see generally what categories these might align with. But again, as you'll see, there's a lot of flexibility in how municipalities can adopt these different recommendations and kind of how far they can take them.
All right, so the recommendations that are shown on this slide are both tools that a municipality can enact, which have defined procedures and penalties for non-compliance. And as you can see, number 1 on this list, our first recommendation that we have for municipalities is to consider establishing a private tree cutting bylaw. And as we learned through this project, and as Kaitlin mentioned, this is the most effective tool in protecting trees on private property. When we investigated the available private tree cutting bylaws of the 17 municipalities, we found that there is potential for some creative ways to apply this kind of bylaw. And as I'd mentioned in an earlier slide regarding the application of a private tree cutting bylaw, there's some flexibility in how municipalities are applying these bylaws. And the example being some municipalities apply a private tree cutting bylaw based on the size of the tree, while others have a private tree cutting bylaw that applies to trees within specific land use designations within the municipality. As well, there are variations regarding the process of obtaining a permit to remove a tree on private land. And I'd mentioned that some municipalities have much more stringent and higher standards for that process, such as requiring a report, a full application form, and very clear letters of support and justification for the removal of that tree. While other municipalities just require that a staff member is notified of the intention to remove a tree. So overall, these findings may be helpful as it highlights that a municipality can find flexible ways to enact a private tree cutting bylaw that meets the ultimate goal of protecting trees on private land while also being, potentially more acceptable to more members of the community based on what that applicability of the private tree bylaw is. However, as we also learned through this project and through the staff survey, enacting a private tree cutting bylaw is sometimes not at all a viable option for a municipality, as it's quite tough to get council on board to have that enacted. So with this in mind, our second recommendation for municipalities to consider is to amend existing bylaws, specifically property standards bylaws or similar bylaws, to ensure that trees are maintained in good health, and that if trees are needing to be replaced or are no longer in good health, that they can be replaced or ought to be replaced on that property. All right, and another way to protect private trees is to designate trees as heritage features, which is our third recommendation, to use the Heritage Act to designate trees as heritage features within a municipality. And this, again, can be accomplished through the process as outlined in the Heritage Act. And like for other heritage features, this can establish additional protections from changes or demolitions to designated trees that are on private properties, which allows the municipality, which allows a municipality to have a little more control over the removal of trees. And for example, as you can see on the slide here, there's a picture of a heritage tree in the city of Windsor. So the city of Windsor has designated a number of trees as heritage features, and as well through heritage conservation districts and the associated development and urban design guidelines that follow that heritage conservation district. There's a lot of policies that contemplate the protection of heritage treescapes, such as tree-lined streets. So that falls within our third recommendation.
All right, so our fourth recommendation is to amend official plans and/or urban design guidelines to include tree policies. And this is actually an interesting time to be having this presentation and to talk about this recommendation, because I'm sure most, if not all of your municipalities are either in the process of or getting ready to update your official plans. So it might be a good time to sneak some tree policies in there. And I think generally this recommendation speaks for itself, emphasizing adding policies and guidelines to these documents to protect trees. And of course, this can be done in a variety of ways and can also be tailored to reflect the overall ideologies that the municipality subscribes to. For example, with regards to native and non-native species, assisted migration, natural heritage. You can also use these plans to lay out lay out replacement ratios, cash in lieu payments, et cetera, et cetera. And we do include several examples of kind of this flexibility and some interesting implementations throughout our practice guide with specific excerpts and references to these documents. So I would definitely point you in that direction if you're looking for some specifics. And kind of related, our fifth recommendation is that municipalities integrate tree protection and management measures into the development process itself. So through our study, we found that municipalities face a variety of challenges related to trees during the land development process, and they adopt a variety of approaches in attempts to protect trees on development sites. For example, and perhaps most traditionally, this could include adding different requirements to the development checklist for an application to be deemed complete at the municipality. For example, the requirement of a tree inventory study, a tree survey, an arborist report, a certain degree of detail in landscaping plans, etc. But this can also include some more novel approaches, some of which are highlighted on the screen. So for example, I believe it was both Barrie and Mississauga have adopted fines for situations where it's evident that the landowner or developer has cut trees down prior to submitting an application. And another municipality had a similar approach, but they would actually continue the site plan process as if those trees were still present. So pretty interesting there. And another example is in Thunder Bay, where they actually take part of what would be the tree planting budget for a new development, and they plant the trees themselves. This gives them increased choice as to, what species of trees are planted. And they also said they were generally able to do this in a faster manner than would be done by developers. And another kind of more recent experience I've had for a phased development project is that the municipality requested that just as the development is phased, that perhaps the removal of trees could be phased as well. So that was an interesting one there. And we'll move over to our sixth recommendation, which is to ensure that a tree vision is developed and maintained consistently throughout all policy documents, programs, and municipal outputs and activities, and also with amongst municipal staff. And we know that due to their internal structure, municipalities are inherently siloed, and tree protection and management often falls under the responsibility of several departments. So because of this structure, we believe it's important to create some sort of vision statement or a set of goals and beliefs with regard to urban trees and canopy coverage, and to use that as the foundation for all municipal activities that intersect with tree protection and management.
Moving on to our seventh recommendation, we recommend that tree planting ratios be included in the urban forest management strategy. It is established in literature that native trees can be well adapted and could contribute positively to local ecosystem. But it's also known that some of the non-native trees are better suited for harsh growing conditions, especially in urban environment where temperatures can be very high. So of the municipality studies, we saw that no plants indicated target ratios when it comes to native to non-native or female to male trees planting. So none of the municipalities have this in any of the policy documents. So we recommend that these target ratios be included, and we also recommend that the tree species, the recommendations put up by municipalities should put up tree species in with consideration of what ratio of native to non-native trees should be planted within the municipal boundaries. And we also recommend that it's really important to leverage perimeter trees. and this can be done especially through preserving perimeter trees during the site development process. And it's also important to integrate into the policy that there should be very minimal disturbance to the root system of the trees. And our next recommendation is to update canopy cover strategy. There are no real recommendations, like no real universal practice which is accepted in Ontario. There are no standards across Ontario and Canada as of now as to what are the best monitoring and tracking system for urban canopy. So we recommend that at least municipalities should adhere to international or American standards, which are more well established, and also to help the province and at provincial or federal level to come up with canopy cover targets to help increase canopy cover in municipalities. And finally, we saw that across municipalities, many of them are adapting their forest management strategy to climate change. So it's because of the future climate conditions would be different, and so it would be hard to not. We need to be planning for urban canopy, which is more resilient to changes. So municipalities are adopting practices like assisted migration, which lets trees which are more resilient to present and future climatic conditions. And also it's important to think about ecosystem services and it's important to link ecosystem services to specific land uses when it comes to tree species selection, because thinking about ecosystem services will also lead to increased resilience of that urban environment.
So our last two recommendations relate specifically to programs. So as Kaitlin mentioned, through the interviews, we heard that programs are quite integral in addition to policy to ensure a robust tree protection and tree conservation approach for both private citizens as well as kind of within a municipal structure. Through the research and staff survey, we learned that when residents are educated about the importance of trees, the types of trees that grow in their community or maybe should grow in their community, and how to actually care for those trees that are on their property, that they're more likely to play an active role in tree protection, which of course makes sense. So that might be through policing a private tree bylaw, advocating for heritage designation, or participating in planting events, all of which can help preserve and enhance the municipality's urban tree canopy. So in order to cultivate kind of a wide ethos of tree conservation, increasing tree planting numbers, keeping trees alive longer, and adding a level of community enforcement for private tree bylaws, we developed these two recommendations that relate to programming. So the first one specifically references what Kaitlin was mentioning about partnerships. So whether it's with an organization like LEAF, which does a lot of work in Southwest Ontario, to not only broaden the reach of programming, but also ensure that the programs might last for the whole year, or that there's a longer and more consistent way to accept funds related to tree programs, and then creating resident-focused education programs that can educate residents and also city staff and general citizens about trees in order to develop that culture of conservation. Oops, sorry, jumped the gun there. There we go, okay. Sorry about that. So again, our practice guide is online. The full guide's content including the appendices. So feel free to access it directly and also ask us any questions you have about it. So we'll now open the floor up to any questions or comments you may have. And of course, feel free to reach out to any of us at any time if you want to consider the conversation or you have any other questions or comments about the guide later.